going.
Thanks, Laura. Yeah, hi everyone. My name's Warren. To those who don't know me, I'm acting biodiversity officer at Nillumbik at the moment. I've been in the role since May last year, and I'm backfilling for Julia Franco, who I'm sure a lot of people will be familiar with. I'm really excited about tonight. It's a topic I'm pretty passionate about, so I hopefully can go over a bit about the threatened species that call Nillumbik home. And we're not going to go over everyone because unfortunately don't have time. But yeah, hopefully I'll give you a good overview of currently their sort of status in the Shire, the sort of the numbers and their trajectory in terms of where they're headed, and also a few of the threats that are local to Nillumbik, but as well as the more global threats I guess they're facing, and then a bit of what Nillumbik and other volunteers and groups are up to in Nillumbik. So first off, I'd like to acknowledge tonight that I'm on Wurundjeri land and I want to pay my respect to the traditional owners on the country on which Nillumbik is located. Pay my respects to elders past, present, and extend that respect to all First Nations people. Especially always like to acknowledge that their ongoing connection to country and my willingness and want to work with them to work on their land and look after the country, including their earth, sky and waters. So that sovereignty was never ceded. So for tonight, just want to make sure that I'm coming to you loud and clear. So if anyone's having any issues with hearing me, I think there is an option to get some of the captions up as well. So just let me know if you can't hear me or need some further explanation on anything as well. I'll try to not use technical terms where possible, try and use common names, try and use, just layman terms. But yeah, certainly if you need anything further explained, please, by all means, let me know. And hopefully that, we can make sure that everyone understands all that we're talking about. So especially on that, like with terminology around threatened species, I guess just to be very broad, that a threatened species is generally a plant or animal or any species that's at risk of extinction that can be considered at a national level and state level or even regional or local level. It could be that it's even considered at a reserve level in some cases. So there is some legislation that we work under, and you may hear people talking about EPBC Act, the Flora and Fauna Guarantee Act, and they're bits of legislation at a Commonwealth or state level. And then you may also hear us talking tonight or people in general about regionally threatened species. So that's more like a general list of where ecologists may decide something's at a risk of going extinct, say at a Nillumbik local level or at a general Melbourne level. And that's where we might come up with something that's regionally threatened. So it might be safe in Northern Victoria, but in Southern Victoria that it's headed in, unfortunately in a negative direction and therefore is regionally threatened as well. Each state and even at national level, there's generally different criteria for how we determine threatened species, and then a lot of them around different categories of where they are in terms of being threatened. A lot of the states and federal government now are trying to standardize this a lot more, and they follow the IUCN's red list categories that are up there on the screen. I think around last I heard there was about 100 to 200,000 species worldwide had been gone through this sort of red list categorization, which is, a drop in the ocean in terms of number of species out there, but a large number of Victoria's species have gone through that now, and that's sort of trying to standardize that at a national level as well. So you can sort of see there's a sort of a not evaluated level. So obviously that's something that hasn't actually been evaluated against the criteria. So you're not sure whether it's not even been considered whether it's a threatened species or not. Data deficient basically means there's not enough known about it. Least concerns, generally the category where something that's common, is not listed as threatened, would sit in. Near threatened would be something that's, on the edge, but, still relatively stable or has got enough species or populations out there that wouldn't be threatened. And then we go through the more categories around vulnerable, endangered and critically endangered. for every species, it's different where that might sit. Something that's vulnerable may still have sort of a relatively stable population, but maybe in, down to low numbers, and it could tinker and go down towards endangered if there's a few more threats come along. But then something like critically endangered is pretty much on the edge of being extinct, and some catastrophic events or something may tip it into the extinct category quite quickly. One thing to really emphasize with, threatened species is that a lot of the time they're well studied and charismatic species. We think about the large animals in Africa and Asia, like elephants and bears and pandas, and all these species that, really strike a chord with the general public, and they're well researched. People will, know a lot about them. You might have, a lot of researchers out there, tens of thousands, studying one tiger or whatever. But, a lot of what we don't know is the invertebrates, and the less charismatic species, that are hard to study, but I suggest, less in the public interest as well. So even tonight, what we'll talk about are some of the better, well-known species in Nillumbik, and unfortunately, there's a lot out there we don't know a lot about as well. So I've sort of broken it down a little bit, tonight's talk, into thinking about, I guess, the flora and then the fauna, and also categorizing it down from a national, or species that are listed at a national level, and down to the state and then regional level. So this is sort of a list that I've taken from what we call the Victorian Biodiversity Atlas, which is the state's biological database, the Victorian Biological Database, and where a lot of the information on species is actually collated and kept. So I can go into that and then search at a local level to find all the threatened species in there. And from a national, things that are listed on the Environment Protection Biodiversity Conservation Act, which is the federal act for protection of threatened species. These are the listed flora that have been found historically in Nillumbik. Two of those species, Caladinia robinsonii and Pterostylus chlorogramma, which is the Frankston spider auk and the green-striped greenhood, are both species that are unlikely to have occurred. They're misidentifications or been recorded historically before they were taxonomically well known. So they sort of sit there, but they're probably not ever considered to have occurred. Then there's a few more. There's around 8 other species that have been recorded and are still present in Nillumbik today. I'm going to touch on about 5 of those ones now as we go through. So the first one's the charming spider orchid, or Caladinia mina. So this is an endemic species to Nillumbik, meaning that it's only known to occur in Nillumbik's Shire Council's area. It's only known from actually 3 sites now, and it's actually listed on one of Australia's most likely species to go extinct, which was a report that was done 2 or 3 years ago. So, it's potentially one of Nillumbik's most threatened species. Historically, it occurred across central Victoria and was known from sort of Clunes and sort of Inglewood and the Box Ironbark country. But over time, the populations have decreased, become extinct due to habitat clearing and other factors. And now we're only left with 3 sites. One's on private land in Wattle Glen, and then there's 2 sites in the Plenty Gorge parklands. And you can see there that there's only one of the private land has about 120 plants, 50 of which are flowering, and the 2 Plenty Gorge sites have less than 10 plants. So it's a species right on the edge of extinction. 1 or 2 of catastrophic events and it will be gone from the face of the earth. And yeah, unfortunately, it's really threatened to this day. On numbers, but Nillumbik received a grant from the federal government and the state government several years ago, and facilitated a lot of management works, especially on the private land. And that property now had around 30 to 40 plants, is now up to 120. So it's going in the right way in terms of numbers, which is great, but still very, very low numbers altogether. And, these are species that are poorly known, that are much more endangered than some of our more well-known kind of species that get all the media attention as well. So on the picture there, you can sort of see there's what we call a herbivore exclusion fence has gone up. So a fence that was keeping out deer and rabbits, there's feral species, but as well as kangaroos and wallabies and anything else that would like to eat it. So that was one of the first management actions that went up in more recent times. That property owner and now has sort of works with contractors to undertake weed control as well. And that's sort of one of the other main management actions. At the time when the first recovery efforts are starting off, they did a lot of pollinator attracting plantings of species of our local flora, which was done to try and attract the pollinator, which is needed for that, which is a specific species which is needed to ensure that that orchid can actually pollinate and then set seed. Otherwise, people were doing it by hand as well to try and get the germination going. So we've been fortunate that we've had that now in place. Another thing that's been going on has been collecting of seeds so this plant can be grown at the Royal Botanic Gardens. And we've got that hopefully now growing at the Royal Botanic Gardens and several hundred plants that will now allow us to re-establish further populations in time and hopefully give a good boost to the numbers as insurance as well. We still don't know a lot about the species, especially things like genetics, like going down to those really low numbers, what it really means, how inbred may they be. But I guess the fortunate thing is that you still got to remember that the species is still there and still present. And hopefully we've got sort of arrested that decline, get some more populations going, supplement the populations at Plenty Gorge, get some more numbers up and give it a real fighting chance. The other one, spider orchid I want to talk about tonight is the Rosella spider orchid, which may be more familiar to people. It's a bit more of a renowned local endemic species to Nillumbik. It occurs in populations from Cottles Bridge to Research, Eltham South, Christmas Hills. So it's known from sort of a wide range of locations in Nillumbik. Bit less threatened than the charming spider orchid. You know, in the wild, we're still down to 100 to 200 plants, but in the last few years, we've been fortunate to have had the Royal Botanic Gardens grow some plants, and now we've had 500 to 600 plants put back in the ground. So, you know, we've quadrupled the sort of wild known population of this species, which is hopefully, again, given us insurance against catastrophic events at some of our sites. Again, this species was really in decline at a few of the sites, and it's only through intensive management that we're actually arresting that decline and getting it back similar to the charming spider orchid. It's had to go through some really significant intensive on-ground works around excluding herbivores and keeping, caging them to keep, people might know white-winged choughs, which are a bird which will dig up the tubers, as well as possums, wombats, wallabies, kangaroos, deer, the list goes on of species, fauna that want to eat them, dig them up and eat the tubers. So, the other, large risk that we've got with these populations is things like disease and pathogens, which are a bit of an unknown at the moment, but do have a massive risk in terms of wiping out whole colonies, especially when you're down to those really low numbers, growing in concentrated little areas as well. One of the populations that's on a council reserve is down to one plant, and it's only been one plant for several years now. So that's that's a population that we've got to look at now and go, what do we do with that? Is it sort of let it go and concentrate on other sites that have more numbers, or do we want to go and supplementary plant? It's sort of a tough decision to make to let something that's this endangered go, but it's something that we may have to look at. This is a site in the pictures on Parks Victoria land where there's been intensive management, and it kind of looks like gardening, but it's been the most effective method in having plants establish, grow on, pollinate, set seed, and create juveniles. So this is a planting that was done 2 or 3 years ago in a method that Parks Victoria have been using, and councils now are also replicating on another property. And it's been quite successful, especially using the moss that you can see in the screen, the little sort of bright green blobs as sort of a mulch, but it also acts as a germination bed for seedlings as well. And so this has been sort of the intensity of management that's needed to recover this species and hopefully turn that around into a better outcome from where it was going. But another major threat for this is climate change and the changing rainfall patterns, increasing solarization, sun solarization. We're losing sort of trees. There's more sun rays getting in. It's dry. The ground's drying out quicker. There's less chance for when germinants actually pop up for them to actually succeed and become successful reach maturity. So these are all the considerations in the land managers have to make in terms of how do we manage these sites, what's best for these sites. So it can be a little bit controversial with some methods, but in this case, it's really a last ditch attempt to try and recover this species as well.
Warren, just a quick question
Yep.
before we get to another species. Who's the pollinator species for the charming spider orchid?
That's a great question, and it's a thionide wasp. So the charming spider orchid's a wasp. It's attracted and it flies around on those warm early autumn, early winter, late winter, early spring days. And so yeah, so it's I haven't got the name in front of me. I can dig it up, but again, a lot of these orchids have a relationship with a specific pollinator, and like I think there's some research came out quite recently. A lot of orchids, they only have one pollinating species, so you lose that pollinator, whether it's a bee or wasp or another insect, and basically you're not going to get successful pollination or reproduction of those plants. So they, another problem with climate change is shifting weather patterns in terms of when pollinators can actually fly, and sometimes these orchids will start flowering too early and then the pollinator comes out later. Obviously there's effects of other things from climate change, such as increased intensity of fires and those type of things as well, that can impact on the sort of pollinator in that relationship as well. So it's a real problem that, we're not just losing one species, but it's multiple species and the flow and effects in the ecosystem from that.
Thank you.
I'll find out the pollinator name and I'll pop in the chat later on.
Cool, thanks.
So clover glycine is another nationally threatened plant. It's sort of grows in the sort of fertile grasslands and woodlands from South Australia up through Victoria, Tasmania, and also in ACT and New South Wales. It's nationally vulnerable and it's also listed as endangered in Victoria. In Nillumbik, we've got several populations, and in total, probably about 300 to 400 plants across those populations. Most populations are down less than 100 plants. You can sort of see the areas that it grows in. It's generally across the range in Nillumbik as well. We were fortunate to find another plant. So we've got Panton Hill in there. So that was a rediscovered population in the last couple of weeks. But the Eltham and St Andrews populations have sort of been well known for a long time and been under active management, both on council and Parks Vic land. And then there's one other private land population on private land in Cottles Bridge as well. So this is sort of, as the picture shows, a pea. It does have a seed pod like a pea. It's got in the leaves, which are in the background there, are like a clover as well. Pretty small, dainty little thing. A lot of the time it's only, maybe a dozen sort of trifoliate leaves like that, and doesn't look like much. Really impacted by things like rabbit grazing, and where they just keep on hammering it, and it's got quite a big, deep ligna tuber, which helps it survive dry and wetting times, but just can't tolerate long-term grazing like that. So unfortunately, been lost across a lot of its historic range. As well as that, it's sort of affected by a changed fire regime. So where we lose fire from the landscape, as a lot of the fabaceae or the peas, such as other things like wattles, where they need that sort of fire regime to, stimulate soil stored seed, they don't get that germination and new recruit. So as you lose old plants, you're not getting new ones coming through, and weeds and sort of overcrowding on the forest or woodland floor can also lead to things such as competition from weeds and really a loss of the intertask space that the species relies on. Also got sort of introduced pest insects, which eat and feed on the seeds as well. So, numerous different threats, coming at this. It's not just one or two, but, it seems like at every stage of its life cycle, it's under threat. So Nillumbik have worked with Parks Victoria and a few volunteers to over time to sort of do seed collection and propagation. So the picture there of that in flower there is at Edendale Farm, where we've got plants from different populations growing, and we can now sell it as a retail plant, which is great. And we hope to do some reintroductions to bolster populations over time as well. We've got a lot of grazing exclusion fences again in place, just to stop the rabbits and the wallabies and the roos just really getting stuck into it, and hopefully give it a bit of relief from that grazing over time. And there's other things that need to be done, which are a bit more complex, such as sort of trying to get some of the other symbiotic or companion plantings in place to try and attract the pollinators to hopefully get some more pollination going on for the species. A lot of those actual plants that attract pollinators are threatened in themselves in Nillumbik as well. There's a lot of what we don't know is around the genetics, and a lot of these populations have been fragmented and for a long time. And again, it's are they inbred? What's going on? With that genetics, is there sort of genetic depressions going on, and are they actually capable of reproducing successfully as well? Another one that might be familiar to people is matted flax lily or Dianella amina, which is actually a lily, I guess as the name suggests, which is deciduous, which dies down through the summer months and then pops up as quite a grass-like stem in sort of winter with the winter rains, and has that beautiful fragrant flower come late spring into summer. Again, similar to the clover glycine, it's found across the sort of fertile country from New South Wales through ACT and Victoria in those sort of grassy woodlands and grasslands as well. A lot of which, you don't really think of Nillumbik as having those sort of woodlands, but we do have a lot of affinities with like the Western Basalt Plains, with some of the land around like Eltham and St Andrews as well, where it is actually quite fertile, and some of these species do persist as well. This species sort of is known again across the Nillumbik area. It actually was the first plant was actually described from a Nillumbik population in Cottesbridge. So the first time someone, what we call the type population. So it's sort of a deeply rooted in the Nillumbik area as well. It does suffer a lot from hybridization with other Dianellas, so it can be a bit hard sometimes to get 100% accurate identification on it, but you can kind of, I should see from this photo here, this is it in near where I live in Watsonia, growing in some grassy sort of area underneath some high voltage power lines. But in that photo in the middle there, you can kind of see the small teeth that grow up the stem on that plant. So in the glaucous broadleaf, so that's quite a good diagnostic feature. And it is able to persist in sort of rough lawns, and you're not talking about high quality areas. So this is basically growing in a weed infested area, which is mown by council constantly in Watsonia, and it is persisting there. So it is tolerant of growing in urban landscapes as well, which is quite a fascinating thing. That a lot of the time we think of threatened species as growing in national parks and not really growing in urban environments, but this is a species that somehow sort of been able to adapt to growing in those areas. And I think as a selling point to the general community, that it's a great thing to show that in our backyards or just around the corner in urban areas that we can have the species persisting as well. In Nillumbik, it does grow a lot in sort of reserves where we've sort of stopped mowing, and it's been able to come back up and flourish after that. It does have a blueberry that's bird spread as well, so it is able to get around a little bit, but yeah, it's quite an interesting little plant that I think would do well in people's gardens. So I'm hopeful that Edendale are able to sell it, and people can have a threatened species growing in their yard, and in Eltham and other residential areas of Nillumbik as well. We try to do a bit of monitoring it just to track its trajectory over time, but it seems to be, once it's protected, relatively stable. And as it's rhizomatous, it sort of spreads out a bit too. So just forms bigger mats, and they're quite important for pollinating species such as blue-banded bee as well, which buzz pollinate it, the flowers there. So they're reliant on that relationship with native bees to pollinate the species as well. So those last species we talked about are nationally threatened plants, but there's also a lot of state threatened plants which occur in Nillumbik as well. There's somewhere in the region of 50 state listed plants that have been recorded over time. Just to highlight the variety that we do get, then you can see up on the page there, there's the Melbourne yellow gum, which occurs that picture's taken on Wattle Glen on the roadside, but it's also in research, but a large numbers of them are in the Plenty Gorge area on the west of the Shire. Close affinities with obviously the box ironbark and goldfields region of central Victoria as well. But this has been taxonomically described as a distinct subspecies of the yellow gum. But a recent book by an expert in eucalypts suggests it's actually not an actual subspecies. So again, one of the things with threatened species is a lot of the time that they can be taxonomically in question as well. But at the moment, this is listed as critically endangered in Victoria, and you know, quite an important species for a lot of our threatened woodland birds. Then we've got pale swamp everlasting, which generally occurs on the western basalt plains and west wetlands, but we've still got some small populations persisting in creekline herbrich woodland, which is a threatened ecological vegetation type in Nillumbik, which occupies sort of ephemeral waterways as well. So can be quite a wetland system, but this one is up in Panton Hill, quite a large stand of it up there, and quite a beautiful little flower, important for butterflies. Then in the pink flowers, native geranium. So everyone will know the geraniums from their sort of gardens and that, but this is actually a native geranium. This is geranium species 3, which is very, you know, well named, but hopefully one day it'll be fully described. And yeah, quite a common sort of species across Nillumbik, and again in the, you know, the fertile areas of that area. And yeah, it's sort of again threatened by rabbit grazing because it has a tuber which it dives back to, but ongoing rabbit grazing will just keep gnawing it and eating it back until it can't persist. As well. And then the one on the far right is slender starwort or Levenhookia sonderii, which is a tiny little 5 centimeter tall herb, which is related to the trigger plants. If anyone's familiar with the stylidiums, where they have a tiny little trigger on the style of the flower, which flicks back when an insect lands on it. But these are little annual herbs, which you would miss if you're just walking through until you sort of see a carpet of little white flowers as well. So quite a beautiful little thing, and very fortunate for Nillumbik to still have this sort of what we call inch flora. So there's a lot of little tiny herbs out there, you know, 5 to 10 centimeters high that, yeah, occur in intertushic spaces and rocky areas where not much else grows, but they're able to come up late winter with the rains, get up, flower, die back annually, and which is not a great life cycle if you're sort of being preyed on by rabbits and roos and those types of things. And yeah, so that's sort of a snapshot of the plants of Nillumbik. Hope that gives you sort of a good idea. Obviously, there's about 45 other state listed flora species out there. And again, you know, I could do 3 or 4 more hours on those, and I'd love to. So, but we have to move on. To regionally threatened plants, and this, like I sort of explained at the start, is a bit of a subjective list. This is sort of more expert ecologists might give some consideration to what they see as species that I guess are not formally listed as threatened under national state legislation, but rather species that fall outside that or haven't been nominated yet, but are definitely that should be nominated under one of those lists, or are at very high risk of extinction, sort of at a regional level, such as the Nillumbik Council area. We've got, so Christmas guinea flowers, Hybertia porcata, which is known from only 2 sites in Victoria, one in Christmas Hills and one on the Bend of Islands. Again, sort of, it's a beautiful species, well worthy of horticultural use in the garden as well. And I know Indale has that, but yeah, and we're working on a nomination for hopefully getting that listed and soon. In the middle is woodland plume orchid, which is a species that's been listed as threatened before in the state, but taxonomically it jumps around a lot. And so at the moment, it's just considered part of the common plume orchid group and is not actually listed, but orchid experts tell me that it is quite distinct and should be considered its own separate entity in itself. So one day, hopefully that'll be listed as a separate species and also nominated and listed under state or federal legislation. And on the right, it's downy twiggy bush, it's Lyria tomentosa. That's only known from 2 sites in the state, and both are in Nillumbik. One's on a roadside in Panton Hill and another on a conservation reserve in Christmas Hill. So again, populations of between 50 and 100 total in the wild in the world, and it's not even listed as threatened in the state or nationally, which is I guess that potentially opens it up to accidental clearing and development as well if it was to happen. We'll move on to the fauna, and I'll start off with a couple of the invertebrates that are actually listed in Nillumbik, and this one will hopefully be well known to most, given it's quite a totem species for the Eltham area and Nillumbik as well. It was only listed as critically nationally endangered in 2015, so it hasn't been actually listed for that long at a national level, but at a state level, it's sort of been a sort of a well-known threatened species since the mid-80s. It's endemic to Victoria, known from sort of the Nillumbik Banyule areas, but now there's sort of been more and more searches done in Western Victoria. There's larger populations have been found over the last couple of years. It has been known in Castlemaine and Coniver and those areas, but a few more populations sort of in those areas have popped up, which is great. So there's a bit more security around that species. Even in the Nillumbik area, there's been a couple of new populations that have been found in the Eltham area in the last several years, which is great. Again, just giving it a bit more security. And one other population that hadn't been seen for several years was refound as well. So that's in part to citizen scientists getting around and actually looking for the species, and and things like iNaturalist have gone a long way in promoting citizen science and getting people out searching, and that's one of the benefits for land managers and ecologists, is that we get to see people picking up these sort of things around the place, and it's really great for the species, but also just as a land manager to see that people are out there searching and finding threatened species as well. So this species only flies sort of in that December to March period. It's still flying at the moment, and about it's got a relationship. The larvae or the caterpillar feeds on sweet Phaceria plants. It's got attendant ants and the Tonkus ants, which look after and protect the larvae, and also they get a benefit from the larvae as well. So there's this ongoing relationship, which is done well as evolutionary over time, but unfortunately in these days with our threatening things, one of those missing links can really quickly mean that species goes extinct. So if the loss of the sweet Phaceria or the loss of the ant will mean that's things like Eltham copper butterfly, which have those relationships, will just die out. Obviously, things like where Eltham copper butterfly lives in Eltham is that it's quite urbanized now, and there's a lot of habitat loss and degradation going on from urbanization, and things like climate change has seen quite significant changes in the kind of the reserves and that areas. They occur as well with the death of trees and shrubs and that type of thing, and we're getting a change in the floristic communities as well. So things like Bergen or Cassinia are growing up and dealing with those drier periods where the sweet Phaceria might be dying out over time as well. And that sort of climate change with increased solarization and heat will also affect the ants as well. So there's a lot going on in those little reserves, and again, a lot we don't know about in terms of genetics and that type of thing. But the hope is that a lot of these like things like Eltham copper butterfly will persist with the right management as well. You might have seen, if you live in the Eltham area, that there has been a lot of shrub removal of the species such as Cassinia, which don't benefit the butterfly, and trying to open it up and allow a bit more ability for the butterflies to fly around and search for their I guess the males searching for females, but also to hopefully increase the amount of beneficial plants as well in there. So council got a grant from the federal government 2 or 3 years ago, and have had done some really intensive management in a lot of those Eltham reserves, and we're hopefully starting to see some benefit in terms of the numbers of Eltham copper butterflies. And then there has been a slight increase. I haven't got the last round of figures, but we've sort of stabilized populations that were on a downward trajectory. So there's a lot of work in managing threatened species, especially these ones that need a lot of intensive management in small fragmented reserves, but hopefully we can just get those populations stable and then look at how we can strategically link them up back over time as well. This is another butterfly, which I don't know a great deal about, and not a lot's known in the Nillumbik area. There's been historic populations for the large ant blue butterfly in the Plenty Gorge and King Lake National Park, but there's been one possible sighting in Christmas Hills in the past 10 years, but that's it. It's listed in Victoria as endangered. It occurs across the sort of full range of Victoria, from sort of Genoa right through to Little Desert, but only as very small populations. And given we don't know a lot about butterflies and there's not a lot of people out searching for it, there hasn't been a lot of recent records until there's a bit of searching going on at the moment. Again, like the Elton copper butterfly, it's got a relationship with an ant, the coconut ant, which again is a species not a lot known about. There's potentially several different species, but at the moment they're all included under the one species of coconut ant, and the female butterfly will lay their eggs in the ant nest itself, and then the ants will look after and care for the eggs and the larvae over time before they hatch. The males will hilltop, which is they'll find a large sort of peak to fly around and search for the females at that peak, and they'll mate, and then the females will fly back to that coconut ant nest. So this relies on, you know, both having the butterfly, but that the ant is critical to this. So if we're not managing the ant, then the butterfly won't be able to persist. So we're hoping to do some work in the future, searching a bit more for these coconut ant nests, and maybe looking at how we can manage these ant nests as well as managing the habitat of the butterfly as well. And fingers crossed that it's still a species which persists in Nillumbik. Southern toadlet is another species which is in dire straits in Nillumbik. So it is a species that's found from South Australia through Victoria, in the southern areas of Victoria, and it's also found on the Bass Strait Islands and in Tasmania as well. In Nillumbik, it's only now known from 6 sites, 2 in Panton Hill, 2 in Christmas Hills, or 3 in Christmas Hills and 1 in North Warrandyte, where there used to be people talking about hundreds of thousands of these toadlets. Now most populations are, you know, between 5 and 30. So, you know, we've had this massive population crash and reduction down to only a very small number of sites in the Nillumbik area. It's similar right across the Melbourne region, where the species was widespread, and again, it's now sort of been reduced down to a few sites in Listerfield and Churchill National Park. Again, very low numbers, and on the Morning Peninsula. Thankfully, it seems to be doing okay still in some of the sort of morasses in sort of East Gippsland, and I said down towards like Glenelg and that area of southwestern Victoria, but in real trouble in Nillumbik, and the prognosis is not really good. So it's now it's a autumn breeding frog. So at the moment it would start calling, especially with the rains in the last day. It sort of, the males call when we start having those wet, humid autumn days and nights, trying to attract a female. The female will lay eggs around an ephemeral pond, and then it'll come, the male will sit on it and guard those eggs as well. So in that picture, you can sort of see a ring of green, which is sort of Carex and Lamandra around an ephemeral pond. This is actually an old dam on a creek line where we know we've got a population. And so those frogs, the eggs will be laid and wait on the autumn rains to fill ponds up, and then the eggs will actually float into those ponds and hatch. And then the tadpoles will have to sit and wait and grow and metamorphose, and hope that those ponds have the right amount level of water in them right through the winter into spring months before they fully metamorphose and can move out. So it's really reliant on the right rainfall conditions. And so where we're going with climate change and altered rainfall is that we're moving from less winter rains into sort of a more summer storm kind of monsoonal area in Nillumbik. So unfortunately, these ponds just aren't filling as much, and therefore we're losing the breeding habitat for the toadlets, as well as having things like chytrid fungus, which is a disease which seems to be really affecting it as well, and it's probably another significant contribution to its decline as well. So my previous roles within Melbourne Water, we've done a lot of work on this species, trying to protect its habitat, trying to do things such as fence these areas off to prevent deer getting in and creating wallows, and rabbits and roos eating up all the riparian vegetation as well. Trying to look at how do we maintain water in these systems through winter when we're getting dry periods. And the other main problem we can have is if we do get a really big downpour through winter into spring, it can just move and remove all the tadpoles out, and they washed away and desiccate and die. So they're really species that aren't dealing well with climate change and all the other impacts of habitat loss and fragmentation as well. Hopefully we can sort of turn that around, but yeah, when you're down to sort of 2 or 3 calling males in the creek line, it's not really looking too good, unfortunately. Another
Hey,
species.
Warren, sorry,
Yep.
just FYI, we've probably got about 10 minutes left,
Yep.
so we have time for a
I'll
question at the
race.
end.
Yeah, no worries.
Cool, thank you.
All right, swift parrot. So this species that people might be a bit more familiar with is a migratory parrot that breeds in Tasmania over summer and then flies up to the mainland for winter. Some of the recent research, there's still, I think numbers aren't quite known, but I've seen sort of estimates between 3,000 and 2,000 birds left in the wild. But there also has been some research done that says it could be extinct in the early 2030s as well, because of the significant declines and lack of successful breeding going on in Tasmania as well. So this species, I guess, is not critical for Nillumbik. The habitat's not critical, but it is a species that is seen around Nillumbik a fair bit over those winter months. Last year in Hurstbridge, we had 130 birds seen in, which potentially is representing 33% of the population. So they were feeding in manna gums along the Diamond Creek, but I saw popping up in places like the red gum in the car park behind the butcher's shop as well. There's probably 100 birds sitting in that tree at the moment. So this is where urban tree canopy is really important for not only common birds, but also threatened birds like swift parrot as well. They rely on a wide variety of trees as food sources. And when you've got, species that flower at different times, so yellow gum or yellow box, where they might be needing nectar, you really need those diversity in tree canopy to support that as well. Again, things like climate change are going to really affect the nectar flow and the amount of nectar those trees provide. So we need, and this swift parrot, when they fly to the mainland, they can range from southern Victoria right up to southeast Queensland, and so they'll chase the nectar right across the eastern seaboard. But we do get them in Nillumbik right through in the winter months as well. So they will be hopefully here any day. Is sort of my normal record around is 26th of March is typically a day when I normally start picking them up around Nillumbik. So any day, I reckon, with even some of the southerly winds we've had, they might start arriving back on the mainland. So get to learn their call and keep an ear out for them. Powerful owl. So I guess a few of these species we'll go into now are things that Nillumbik's held a lot of events around before, and hopefully will be familiar to people. But I guess in the recent time with powerful owl, we've had a lot of talk about the secondary generation anticoagulant rodenticides. It's a bit of, or SGARs, which I liked, and there's been a bit of push on because it's been sort of researched that the species have been really affected by that, and eating possums, which have eaten rodent baits, and the build-up of those SGARs is affecting the powerful owl as well. So I think with that sort of research and that real push from BirdLife Australia, it's something that's a bit more understood in the community. And I know, council's getting a lot of inquiries, but definitely looking at if people are still using those to not use them and get on some of that advocacy around trying to get shops to stop selling them, because for powerful owl, if we're losing one or two, from a population in around Nillumbik, that's a big dent on the population as well. Another species that hopefully will be quite familiar to people is brush-tailed phascogale, which is a vulnerable species in Victoria. It's an arboreal carnivorous mammal that relies on hollows in trees for breeding and roosting. Then I always thought they probably needed higher quality connected habitats, but they do move around sort of fragmented landscapes quite well as well. And we have picked them up in sort of isolated trees and paddocks and that type of thing as well over time. We've done some monitoring. They fluctuate with the seasonal conditions. So in those sort of wet years, such as we had where there's a high probably insect diversity and load, that they'll probably do pretty well. But as soon as you're getting the dry years where the insect diversity crashes, that's when they're going to drop in numbers as well. They're pretty widespread across Nillumbik, especially sort of the rural areas from Christmas Hills through to Strathewen and Arthur's Creek and down into even sort of the edges of Diamond Creek as well in research. But there's sort of been a recent record in Eltham South and also on Diamond Creek Road in Greensborough. So they're potentially a bit more able to tolerate urban areas as well. And they do pop up in people's sheds and roofs and that from time to time. But they're also known from King Lake, and we've done some monitoring through our forest health monitoring program, and we do regularly get them in wetter forest as well, which is quite an interesting thing because I guess a lot of people associate them with box ironbark forest and the drier forest. But when we're getting them in sort of messmate sort of areas or even wetter areas, it's quite interesting to think that they might be living in those areas as well. With this species, cats and foxes are one of the main threats to them, as well as habitat loss and loss of hollow-bearing trees. So where you've got a paucity of hollow-bearing trees in the landscape, you're going to have less animals, and they do have a pretty big home range. So a female male will be pretty territorial and will defend a home range as well. So where you've got a real lack of hollows, that home range will increase, and therefore you just have less ability for these species to tolerate, a loss of animals in the landscape as well. So one of the sort of the main management is definitely fox control and trying to keep cats contained at home as well. One of the things the council's been doing is trying to put up more nest boxes, but also looking at habitat hollows such as chainsaw hollows to try and increase the amount of available habitat for this species. I'm sorry, and I'm rushing through this just to try and get through it all, but definitely if there's sort of questions come up, just let me know. Slender-tailed dunnart or common dunnart is another vulnerable mammal species. It's found in Nillumbik. It tends to be in some of the better quality habitats where it's found. If you can sort of see that picture on the right, there's a tile. So one of the actions Parks Victoria and Council has been doing is putting tiles out as artificial refuges for them, where there's a lack of, especially coarse woody debris on the ground as well, and provide houses that are safe, and things like foxes can't get in and dig under and get them as well. So there's sort of been records right across that sort of northern half of Nillumbik in recent years, sort of a pretty strong hold in Christmas Hills area, but been a lot of records in sort of Arthur's Creek and that as well with recent surveys as well. So, but they're pretty patchy and fragmented, unfortunately, in the landscape. So one of the programs Nillumbik runs is a forest health monitoring, which is an annual program which we put out cameras, and this helps us monitor a range of fauna species as well as exotic species such as deer and foxes and cats as well. We did pick up one dunnart in Plenty Gorge, which is probably the first record there for several decades for a small mammal like dunnart, which is great. So they're still persisting in potentially in Plenty Gorge on the western side of Nillumbik, but definitely this is a species that's very vulnerable, to extinction from things like the predation, but also just changing and degradation of habitats. That loss of sort of the lower tussocks in a landscape makes them more vulnerable to predation, but also removes the food source that they rely on. They're also very reliant on the right fire conditions. So continued burning, would have been something that they would have needed to produce sort of the fertile conditions for plants to get up and seed, attract insects and those type of food sources for the species as well.
Warren, we do have a few questions.
Yep.
Maybe we could jump to the what can you do slide.
Sure.
And just talk to that, and just making everyone aware that we will provide this information to you after, so that the last couple of slides you'll be able to get still. Just because that way we can answer everyone's questions and have time for that conversation.
Sure.
I
think, all right, I'm just up to my last one, which I'll race through, Laura, and then we'll get to questions maybe.
Sure.
Is that all right?
Yeah.
So platypus, and again, I guess, sorry, these are all my favorites, but platypus is one of my favorites in particular. So platypus and Nillumbik is, again, like many of our aquatic species, has gone through massive reductions over time in the populations. Some of the research from Melbourne Water shows that the Yarra really will only be the species where they persist in the longer term under the climate change conditions. In Diamond Creek, we've got them, they've really reduced from where they used to be in the headwaters down to the sort of the main section from Hurstbridge to to Eltham. We're not sure if they are breeding. There's potentially they are, but it's more likely they're just males that move up and down. In the Plenty River, they still occur in Plenty Gorge and through Greensborough, but we think they may be old males that aren't breeding as well, and the connectivity down to the Yarra is pretty poor as well. In Watson's Creek, I probably didn't think that there would be many in there, but there's been some recent data showing that they're right up into Christmas Hills as well, potentially just a male transient population moving up and down, but certainly in the lower sections towards the Yarra, where there's still good flows downstream of the Sugarloaf Reservoir, that they are potentially breeding in there as well. So again, like many species we've talked about tonight, climate change is one of the main factors that's a threat to them. That's sort of two examples. The top right photos, pretty poor habitat. There's a lot of erosion weeds going on. So flashy flows as well, leading to that degradation of habitat. Whereas on the bottom left photo, where you've got in-stream woody debris and in-stream vegetation, is great for the habitat, but it's also really good for the food, which is macroinvertebrates platypus rely on as well. So that's sort of a big part of it. It's not just about a good, healthy home for the platypus, it's about what they eat as well. And you need that for the platypus to survive, that in-stream vegetation habitat complexity, because they eat about 80% of their body weight each day, and yabbies and other macroinvertebrates as well. So there's a whole range of threatened flora and fauna in Nillumbik. That's sort of the list of all the threatened fauna. There's about 67 species. I'll leave that for another day to talk about them. But there's also a lot of regionally threatened fauna as well. I guess Nillumbik's looking at those threatened ones, but what are the sort of indicators, and how do we determine if we've got some of these regionally threatened fauna? What's it telling us about the health and connectivity of our habitats as well? Someone asked about the pollinator for charming spider orchid. This is not the one. This is for Caladinia clavigira, the pollinator, which is again another species which hasn't been seen in Nillumbik for a long time and is now affecting the ability for that plain lip spider orchid to reproduce. So I won't try and say that name in a rush. So I've got a bit of a list of what you can do, and the list is always long of what you can do for threatened species, and this is a very broad list, nothing specific to any of the species, but what we've talked to tonight. But one of the main things I want to emphasize is just for people to learn about what are the plants and animals that live in your backyard, in the local reserve, or around where you live. I think it's really important that people just understand what it is, whether it's a common species or threatened species, and just have that connection to nature. That's really important, and that's just the start of the journey in learning more about the threatened species, what they need to survive, what are the threatening processes as well. Laura, was there sort of questions about what you can do that I can answer specifically?
Yeah, sure. There's a few various questions, and other people feel free to pop your questions in now while we're chatting. But one person has just said, if we spot endangered species out and about or in new areas other than what you've discussed, what is the best thing for them to do?
probably two things. You can log it if you're familiar with iNaturalist. You can log it with that. If you're a bit worried that you don't want to put it out there in the public, then maybe email the environment at Nillumbik email address, and it'll find its way to one of the offices here, and we can help you out with either identification and/or how do we log it as a important as its location, and make sure it gets into the appropriate biological databases. So yeah, look, it depends on the species, but certainly if it's something like a new Eltham copper butterfly location, or something you think's really significant, yeah, reach out to Nillumbik or even DECA, which is the State Environment Department, and we can help work out the best plan of action for that. And really welcome anyone to contact myself through that environment at Nillumbik, or yeah, give the council a call and we can go from there.
Cool, thank you. Another one here, how do we differentiate between a dunnart and a rat?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we're looking at these today because we're talking about some of our photos that are on we've taken with wildlife cameras at night. So dunnarts are quite small, and look, I'm definitely not a mammal expert. So if anyone else has any ideas, feel free to pop it in the chat. But dunnarts are quite small. Generally the rule is the introduced rats have a tail that's as long or longer than the body of the rat, and dunnarts generally are quite small. I'd probably more struggle to be able to identify a house mouse versus a dunnart rather than like a rat. So we have things such as Anikinus and some native bush rats and that in Nillumbik. So they can be something that you can mix up between a introduced brown or black rat with a native. But yeah, at that dunnart scale, it's house mouse size. They got a bit more of a pointed snout on them. But there are two dunnart species in Nillumbik, and you really need to have them in the hand to be able to identify them correctly. Cool,
thank you. There's just one more, and then we can do the rat. Just around, one person says, is it true that trees take 100 years to have hollows needed for fauna species?
I was reading today it's 150 years. So I think in Nillumbik, the general tree canopy species, and given the soil conditions, trees are pretty slow growing. So like our red box and yellow box, they're very slow growing species, and to get up and get to a size where they start losing limbs and create hollows naturally, it is a long time. It's manna gums and things along riparian areas along the rivers may take a bit of a shorter time to produce hollows, but in the drier hilltops in those areas, it's going to be 100+ years. It really depends on the conditions, but yeah, so that's where we do things such as nest boxes, which aren't ideal, and there's a lot of research going on about the quality of nest boxes and that, whereas the new approach is looking at things such as chainsaw hollows, or even installing nest boxes which are a bit more thermally improved and maybe better for the animal that's inhabiting them as well. And that's really a stopgap measure. There's nothing better you can do than plant more trees or protect what you've got.
Cool, thank you.
So yeah, so that look, there's a long list depending on where you are and what your time is like, but I definitely, if you're interested to learn more or want to know more about what you can do, definitely go and get in contact with council. There's a lot of friends groups or land care groups out there. Gardens for Wildlife is a program which can help you improve your garden at home for wildlife as well. In Nillumbik, we're lucky that we have threatened species across the urban and rural divide as well. And yeah, you never know what might turn up from time to time, between phascogales and people's sheds and roofs to swift parrots coming and feeding in street trees and in backyards as well. And obviously things such as for the aquatic species like platypus, it's the obvious thing is not, picking up litter and not letting pollution go down the drain as well. So before I wrap up, and I'm happy to hang around if people want to ask me specific questions as well after this, once we stop recording. We've got a few more events coming up. Nillumbik, and these should be on council's website as well. So we do have 2 spotlighting walks that are coming up, one in Pan Hill on the 14th and Twilight Walk for a bit more family friendly in Eltham on the 28th, which will be really great opportunities for people to get out and look at what's coming out at night. On the 14th, there's a bit more of a focus on threatened species, especially spotlighting for things like Fascagale through Bunjil, and listening out for southern toadlet as well. We do have the iNaturalist City Nature Challenge for that weekend, and that's something, if people are interested in iNaturalist and competing and recording things, feel free to get in touch with myself through that. And then we have another fungi walk, which will be really great on Saturday morning on the 3rd of June. I don't think the event's up yet, but watch a space. That should be coming up in the next week or 2, but that date's locked in for that as well. Yeah, so I'm happy if people, if we want to stop recording, Laura, and if people want to hang around and hassle me and ask me curly questions, I'm more than happy to take it on notice, or write down that email address and email me anything you don't feel comfortable on saying on camera as well. But hopefully tonight's been informative, and you know, it's been a bit brief and rushed at times, but hopefully you've just taken away a few little things about what lives in Nillumbik and where things are at. And yeah, hopefully you can take some actions from here as well.
Thanks, Warren. I have popped in the chat some links to just the events and stuff that Warren was just talking about, and we'll also send you a follow-up email with all those events so you can book in that way. So thank you everyone for coming. I'm going to stop recording, and yeah, feel free to ask us more questions while we're here.